Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Aviation Nerd Podcast. Today, we have another very special guest. Her name is Loree Draude, and she served 10 years active duty as a pilot in the U.S. Navy, flying the F-18 Hornet as well as the S-3 Viking. After her time in the Navy was up, she started working in the tech and business industry and helps businesses improve their culture. She also starred in a one-woman show that is all about her career that was off-Broadway. So please help me welcome Loree Draude to the Aviation Nerd Podcast. Dive right in then. So, what got you into aviation?
You know, it was so funny. I was not one of these kids who grew up going to air shows or being fascinated with flying. In fact, I think I maybe had one flight as a kid. My dad was in the Marine Corps, and he was an infantry officer. So I really wasn't around aviation. And so when we would change, stations and move from one place to another, we typically do a big road trip. So we normally didn't fly. So aviation just really wasn't even in my world until my freshman year of college. And I was in Navy ROTC, and over the holiday break, we had a field trip. And I went to school at the University of San Diego. So, big Navy town, big Marine Corps town. And we did a field trip to a bunch of air stations. And back then it was Naval Air Station Miramar. And there were a couple of air stations, Marine Corps air stations up in Orange County, so El Toro and Tustin. And that was really the first time I ever got close to an airplane. And, I mean, these were amazing airplanes at the time too. So I was seeing helicopters and jets and propeller planes. And that was really the first time I became interested in it. And, just talking with the pilots and hearing about the work they did and how much they loved it. And they just were really funny. I just was fascinated. And so when I got back to school, I started looking into it. And it turned out, at the time, there were women pilots in the military, but we were not flying in combat. We were allowed to be instructor pilots or support pilots. So an instructor pilot is someone who teaches a student how to fly, and a support pilot teaches another aviator how to do their mission. Or we might ferry airplanes, or we might do what I actually ended up doing, which is pretend to be a missile. So my job was to fly an F-18 Hornet and to fly missile profiles so that ships and fighter pilots could practice tracking me and pretend to shoot me down. So yeah, it really didn't, aviation didn't become a part of my world until I was in college.
Yeah, interesting. And you mentioned that you did go through University of San Diego ROTC. So you
Yes.
did know you were going to be going into the military because there is a commitment after ROTC. But what kind of career were you aiming for when you did eventually join the Navy?
When I first started in ROTC, I knew I wanted to serve. I just didn't really know how. And so at the time, I thought, well, I'll become what was called an unrestricted line officer. So doing a variety of different roles, but I was hoping to get posted overseas so that I could, get some travel in. I love to travel. And so that was really my plan going into college, was just kind of being open to what might be out there. And I assumed that's what I would do in the military. And then that one field trip literally changed my life. So, yeah, it's so funny how things turn out that way.
Yeah, nice. But you did end up going to flight school. Clearly,
I
you became
did.
a pilot. So how did you succeed in flight school, and what were some strategies that you used to get through flight school and ending up flying the F-18, which we'll talk about later?
Yeah. Well, I majored in mathematics in college, so I think that certainly helped with certain phases of flight school. The aerospace, we did like basic aerospace engineering, the forces of flight. And so it wasn't too complicated, but also navigation, involved math. So those I felt were topics that were not too difficult for me, but um, I would say the biggest thing that helped me in flight school was having a bunch of other flight school students that we all worked together. We formed a study group, so we were able to quiz each other. My roommate she ended up being a helicopter pilot, but we went through primary flight training together. So we actually set up a fake cockpit in our living room where we took there was like a fold out of the cockpit of the T-34, which is the airplane we were learning how to fly. So we had that set up, and we had like a little, I don't know if it was a broomstick or something, and we'd practice, like one of us would pretend to be the air traffic controller or the tower doing the radio calls, and we would just quiz each other on emergency procedures. And so and then I had another study group with four other guys in my primary training. So again, we would always share what we were learning with the instructors that we flew with, so that we would understand, maybe this instructor is really focused on this one part of flying, or somebody else might be a real stickler about another topic. So being part of that team was super important, and being able to share knowledge like that and support one another, that absolutely helped with all the flight training.
Nice. And so clearly you did have a very successful time in flight school because you did end up getting to fly the F-18. But before you
Yes.
graduated from flight school, you had to land on an aircraft carrier. So what was it like to land on an aircraft carrier?
For the first time, it was terrifying. I mean, terrifying, but also super, super cool. I mean, it just, I will never ever forget the first time I flew out over the Gulf. We were flying on it wasn't the Lexington, which was the training carrier that they normally used, but it was one of the fleet carriers was out in the Gulf, and so we flew out from Kingsville, Texas. And I just I will never forget seeing that. And there's like you practice so many times before you go out and land on an aircraft carrier the first time. So you do simulators where you're visually seeing, a video that makes it seem like you're landing on an aircraft carrier. And then at the field, at the air station, you're doing practice landings. I mean, literally hundreds of practice landings. And they have this area on the runway that's painted like the exact size of the landing area on an aircraft carrier. And there's the meatball, the visual landing system that's lighting system that's right next to the runway. So you start visualizing what it's going to be like to actually go out to the carrier and see that meatball lighting system and see that very small landing area. And so you're practicing and practicing for weeks, literally. But then you go out for the first time, and that little landing area is on an aircraft carrier, and it's surrounded by water. And it's moving, and it's just like, oh my God, how did I ever get here? It's just really, really exciting. But it's also this incredible feeling of agency and skill. And I mean, the first time I landed, it was just so much emotion and excitement and terror. And, just like, I can't believe who ever thought of this system? Like, it's just so fascinating how it all came about. But then you settle down, and then you get your first catapult shot, which is a whole other story, which is also incredible and super cool. And then you just, you practice. And typically first time you go out to the aircraft carrier as a student naval aviator, it's challenging because it's the first time you've done it. And so you learn how to get better at it. And you learn the subtle corrections that you have to make. And you learn to get that scan down faster and clearer. And so I loved that part about it, that there's so much hard work and discipline involved. But it's so rewarding when you finally, and sometimes it takes a while, you finally get a decent grade, and you earn it, and it's just like, oh, okay, that's the best feeling in the world. Actually, the best feeling in the world is when the tail hook catches the wire and you know that you're stopping, because I've also had the worst feeling in the world, which is when that hook does not engage and grab that wire and you go around again, which we call a bolter in naval aviation. And that's like the worst feeling in the world.
Yeah, I was just watching a documentary recently about student pilots' first carrier landings, and I can't even imagine how terrifying that would be. But for anybody who doesn't know, at that time, women in naval aviation weren't actually allowed to deploy on aircraft carriers. So were you disappointed finding out that you weren't going to be able to go and fly jets off carriers at that time, or were you eager to go back, be an instructor, fly as a missile, as you said?
Yeah.
Yeah.
At that point, Nathan, I was so happy to be doing whatever I could. I was so happy to be a part of this team of student naval aviators, and learning how to do this. And I went through all the same training as the guys did. The only thing that was different was when we got our wings, I was not allowed to go to a combat squadron. I went to a support squadron. But at that, I remember being on the aircraft carrier when I did my advanced jet training and did my carrier qualifications. And I had a moment when I was getting refueled, so I had, a very short period of time to finally take a breath, and look around and see this incredible teamwork that was happening on the aircraft carrier. And just the amazing accomplishment of launching aircraft and recovering them on a floating, platform on the ocean. And it was starting to get towards sunset, and there were like, probably dolphins swimming off the bow. But I just remember thinking, this is so cool. And I'm really sad that I can't do this, or I'm not allowed to do it. But at that point, I was like, you know what? However I can help serve, I'm going to do that. And so, and flying an F-18 as a missile, not a bad job. So I was really grateful, and I still am. And if that's all I would have been allowed to do, I would have done it. But as luck had it, that ban on women flying in combat was lifted only a year after I got my wings. So that's when I moved over to a combat squadron.
Yeah, so we'll talk about your time flying off aircraft carriers in a little bit, but I do want to talk about what your role was flying the F-18, and yeah, what did you do flying the F-18?
Yeah, so it was pretty basic. I flew in either the Alpha or the Bravo, so the single seat or the two seat early versions of the Hornet. And the squadron was based in Naval Air Station Lemoore in Central California. And so we would go out and we would fly missile profiles. We also would do tests. So we would help out with testing different platforms on the Hornet, because we could go out and just, practice flying and record data on how different missile systems or weapon systems performed. So it was really, it was a great job because I wasn't deploying overseas. I wasn't having to go out on a carrier for a long time and be away from family. We had a couple of detachments where we might go down to Point Mugu, down near LA, or fly someplace else and test out different things. But for the most part, it was it was a really fun time flying that aircraft. However, we knew that that squadron was going to be decommissioned. So as part of the base realignment and closing commission, I think that's what BRAC stands for. A bunch of air stations and military bases were closed down in the early 90s in order to save money. And so our squadron was one of those organizations that was going to get shut down. So I knew that that time was only going to last for so long. So I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed flying the Hornet there.
Yeah, so it sounds like you did have a pretty good time, and you did later get to go on to fly different aircraft off an aircraft carrier. But the F-18, of course, is a fighter jet, and maybe from what I've heard, maybe fighter squadrons may have more of a reputation of being kind of the top dogs in terms of what is being flown. Maybe
Yeah.
they have that perspective, the fighter pilots. So what was it like being a woman in that squadron where they feel like they're the top people?
It's interesting because the squadron that I was in, VAQ-34, which was the support squadron, it was the best assignment that a woman pilot could get, but it was probably the worst assignment that a male pilot could get because it wasn't a combat squadron. It was a support squadron. So within my squadron, it was a mix of male and female aviators. So it was pretty, I had a bunch of other women aviators with me, so that was great. Going through the training squadron was a lot more challenging. And it was right after Tailhook 91. So a lot of, I think there was a lot of anxiety and fear in the fighter squadrons about what changes might happen and what might be different for them. And I think, it's understandable that fighter pilots have a lot of pride in the work that they do because it's a really hard job, and it's a dangerous job. And so, of course, people are going to have a lot of pride in that. So I think, though, for some people in that community, having women come in felt threatening to how they viewed themselves, and they had a hard time accepting that some women could do that job. Not all women, but some, just like not all men can be fighter pilots either. So when I was going through the training for the F-18 Hornet, it definitely was difficult. There were several people, several male instructors there that were not happy that I was there, and were vocal about it. And somehow I made it through, thank God, and I was able to get to my support squadron. But yeah, at that time, it was still it was not the easiest place to be a woman.
Yeah, well, the ban did end up eventually being lifted, so that meant that you were able to go out and deploy on an aircraft carrier. But then you ended up transitioning from the F-18 to the S-3, which maybe not as fast, maybe not as agile. Maybe we can talk about some of the comparisons later on. But were you excited to go deploy? And were you excited to fly the S-3 and transition away from the Hornet, or were you disappointed?
Well, I was initially disappointed, partially because, I had a whole community there in Lemoore and I didn't want to move from that. But also, the F-18 was an amazing jet to fly and I loved flying it. But they had a couple of women who were going through Hornet training in order to go fly them in combat. And they had many, many more hours than I did. I was actually the first woman naval aviator to come straight from the training command into a Hornet training squadron. Every single other women pilot had been flying something else before they transitioned to Hornet. So they had more experienced women who were flying in the Hornet. I was disappointed, but then I had a decision, really. I could have rejected the orders to S3s and tried again the following year. But I also really wanted to be part of that first wave of women. And I felt like I wanted to be able to be out there leading sailors and being part of a squadron. And I didn't want to wait for that. I still was going to be on an aircraft carrier and landing on a carrier. And like that to me was more important than the type of jet I was flying. So I accepted the orders to fly S3s, and I found the community to be incredibly welcoming. And I think part of that is because it's a crew-based aircraft. Like some Hornet squadrons have now they have the front seaters and back seaters, but for the most part, it used to be a single seat community. And so going to the S3 squadron, where you always had at least two people and often four people in the jet, I just felt like the culture was more team-based and welcoming, at least for me as a woman. And so I really, really appreciated my squadron. Even though I know some of the guys there were not happy about the ban being lifted and, again, weren't really sure what to expect, they were really they were fair, and that's all I wanted was just to be treated fairly. And so I had a great experience in that squadron.
Yeah, so you did touch on clearly some of the differences, similarities, and differences between the F-18 and the S-3, but maybe not as crew related, like that you have three extra people. But what were some the similarities and differences specific to the S-3 aircraft? Like, which would you prefer if you could go outside right now and hop in either an S-3 or an F-18? Which would you pick? Maybe I'm asking you to pick favorite kids or something, but
I know. I don't know if I could answer that question. Well, I mean, honestly, right now it would have to be the Hornet because all the S3s are in the graveyard, the aircraft graveyard. So they're not flying anymore. They were decommissioned, oh gosh, probably over 10 years ago. So they're not around anymore. I mean, I loved both of the jets for different reasons, and the S3 was surprisingly nimble, and it was super fun to fly. It was great. It could fly long distances. It was almost fully aerobatic, so it was actually a really fun platform. I wasn't sure what to expect because, of course, in the jet community and in the aviation community, there's always these self-imposed hierarchies about what's the coolest and what's not. And so because the S3 is not, doesn't have a pointy nose, it's typically at the bottom of that hierarchy. But I really enjoyed flying it. It was a great jet for cross countries. You could fit skis in the back, you could fit a bicycle in the back. It's kind of the best of both worlds. It was probably more comfortable than a Hornet, but it definitely was not as fast.
did you guys carry weapons on the S-3 or because
We
what was
did.
the primary role for the S-3?
Yeah, so initially it was anti-submarine warfare. So the S-3 would carry sonobuoys and it would also carry torpedoes and it could carry bombs. We carried Mark 82s, so they weren't smart bombs, but we did carry weapons. And when I flew on both of my deployments, we typically had torpedoes and bombs. But on my second deployment, I don't think we carried torpedoes because we moved away from the anti-submarine warfare mission and we primarily focused on sea surveillance. So we would go out and fly around the aircraft carrier and identify surface targets that might be a potential threat that were being picked up on radar. We would also fly. We didn't really do much overland. There were other airborne platforms that did a better job for that, but we could be a backup for that for I wouldn't call it electronic reconnaissance, but basically just helping to supplement some of the missions that were happening. The primary role by far was in-flight refueling. So especially during my second deployment, we were what was called the organic refueling capability for the air wing. So during launches and recoveries at the aircraft carrier, we would always have an S-3 overhead, and we would carry a buddy store on our wing, and the buddy store was filled with gasoline or jet fuel. So if an F-18 or an F-14 was getting low on gas, they could come up behind us. There was a hose that extended from the back of the buddy store. They would extend a refueling probe and they could plug in and get gas. So we were there to help out the jets, when they came back, if they needed a little bit of extra gas to make sure they had plenty of gas to land on the aircraft carrier. That was really what we did mostly during my second deployment.
Yeah, I heard some story about I don't remember where I heard it. It was an S-3 trying to shoot down a P-3 Orion or something. I heard that. Was that you or was that I don't
That
remember.
was me. Oh, yeah. I mean, we did an exercise called RIMPAC, which is like a workup exercise where we're coordinating with other countries and it's done in the Pacific Oceans and we I'm just laughing because the S-3 has no air-to-air capability. However, we did carry some Zuni rockets, which are technically, I think, air to ground. They're not air to air, but so we simulated that we actually got behind a P-3 and called out to them on the radio that we were shooting a Zuni rocket at them, and because they were pretending to be an enemy aircraft. And so, we called them on the radio and we said that, and the P-3 was like, "Say again, like, what are you doing?" And we said, "Oh, well, we're shooting you down." They're like, okay. And they were based in Hawaii, so they just went home and probably went to the O Club and had a beer while we went back out to the aircraft carrier. But it was just really funny because since the S-3 does not have air-to-air capability, it was just kind of a fun, creative way to try to get an air-to-air kill.
I mean, bragging rights. You can brag to all the fighter pilots. Um,
Yes, we did put a P-3 on the side of that S-3. So
well earned. So I gotta ask, we brought up that the S-3 is a four-person crew, and as the pilot, you are technically the aircraft commander, so you're the person in charge of the aircraft. And maybe there were some other female backseaters, other naval flight officers, but I would assume it was probably at that time a male-dominated career. So were there any strange dynamics if you had three male crew members and you are in charge of that, or was it just regular,
no,
business as usual?
it really was no big deal. In fact, I have a funny story about that. When I first started flying with the squadron, when I first arrived, and I was the only female pilot in my squadron. There was also a female naval flight officer. And again, the squadron's trying to figure out, okay, what does this mean? How should we behave? Do we have to act differently? And I grew up with brothers, and I feel like I have a fairly thick skin, so I wasn't anticipating people, walking on eggshells around me. And so one time, I was flying with my crew, and the officer who was the tactical officer, his call sign was Jedi. He was a prior enlisted, and he was, just kind of listening to the conversation that was happening in the aircraft as we were flying along. And I was pretty quiet, apparently. I didn't realize this at the time, but he took down a note to debrief the aircrew on proper cockpit communication because he had heard the two other guys, maybe swearing or saying some colorful language, and he thought maybe I was being quiet because I was uncomfortable. So that's why he took down this note, debrief the crew on proper communication. And then we came into land. This was towards, at the start of me joining the squadron. So I was still pretty inexperienced at this point. I maybe had, I don't know, gosh, 20 carrier landings at this point. And this was night. And of course, it was off the coast of California. So that marine layer comes in and it's just, there's no horizon. And when I came into land on the carrier, I had too much power in close. So I boltered. I landed past all four arresting gear wires. And when I slammed the throttle forward to take off again, I yelled just this string of profanities because I was so pissed. And Jedi got out his note. He just kind of erased it. And so, it was, I never felt uncomfortable in my squadron. And if ever the jokes were starting to go far, which they did sometimes for other people, and if they ever were kind of pushing the envelope a little bit, I just had to give them a look and they'd be like, okay, okay. But I don't really feel like that happened very often. I felt like we all, we all just really enjoyed kind of giving each other crap all the time and also, making fun of each other. Been in a very, it's like having 30 brothers, uh, like they're going to always have my back, but they're definitely going to give me a hard time.
That's good to hear. You became an LSO, a landing signal officer. So what was your experience being a landing signal officer, grading people's landings,
Yeah.
helping other pilots aboard the boat? How was that experience?
That was one of my favorite things I did as a pilot. I really enjoyed the level of skill that goes into being a landing signal officer and the study of it. There is a landing signal officer school where we went to, I think it was a couple weeks of training around that. But for me, it was personally really fulfilling because I certainly struggled at the very beginning of my first deployment. With all the controversy about women flying in combat squadrons, and then Kara Halt Green was an F-14 pilot who was in my air wing and died while landing on the aircraft carrier. I was actually airborne when that happened. It just, there was a lot of pressure. So I was not one of the top pilots in my first deployment. And for the first few months, I struggled, but I had an LSO in my squadron, Joe Keith, his call sign's Flojo. And he took me under his wing and he said, look, I can see what you're doing wrong. Here's what you need to do. And you need to go up on the flight deck, go stand on the LSO platform in the back and just watch every single landing you can. So if I was not eating or sleeping or doing my ground job, or flying, I was up on that platform watching landings. And so I really studied it and I got better. I was getting lots of landings in and I got better. And so being able to then turn around and become a landing signal officer and help the pilots who were struggling or, just ensure that quality of landings and the safety of landings, that having that job was definitely really satisfying for me. So they were long days. You were up there for all of the landing cycles, which, depending on the day, might start mid-morning, but we'd be up until well after midnight, putting the grades into the computer so that everyone keeps track of everything. And I just really enjoyed the teamwork as well. So it's, a small team, but everyone's working together to ensure that everyone's landing safely. And that's really the ultimate goal is we have these high standards to make sure that we're safe. And being able to have exacting standards is what makes that whole crazy system work all the time.
Yeah. So do you think being an LSO, do you think that actually in the end made you a better pilot in general, or maybe just better pilot around the boat?
Oh, both. I feel like having to study all the landings and to learn how to really measure and assess the energy state on airplanes as they were coming into land. All of that made me appreciate aerodynamics in general much more. But also as a pilot, and being a landing signal officer, there's certainly pressure, to always be on the top of your game. And so I felt like it made me a better pilot, but mostly because I was really focused on landings and all the different factors that go into that. And things like the movement of the ship, the winds that were coming across the deck, any crosswind, all these things. All of those things together helped to make me a better pilot.
Yeah, and now how do you become an Elsa? Do you have to apply or are you kind of voluntold, like, hey, this is what you're gonna do?
It can be both, actually. Um, Typically, at least when I was in, and I got out like 25 years ago. When I was in the squadron, there were typically two or three LSOs per squadron. And so it really was timing. If we had three LSOs, then you'd have to wait until one of them rotated onto a shore tour, and then there would be an LSO spot open, and you could raise your hand and say, "Hey, I'd like to be an LSO." Now, typically, because the LSOs are the ones grading other pilots, you need to be I guess, respected enough that people are going to trust you, and that you know what you're doing and that you can work together with a team. And so I think what happened was we had an LSO opening, and I, you know, probably told one of the senior LSOs that I was interested in becoming an LSO. And by that point, my grades had gotten better, and I had worked hard, and they had improved. So I think by that point, they felt like, okay, she's trustworthy, and she seems to know what she's doing. So, and my commanding officer was like, okay, we're gonna let you do this, but don't screw it up. So, yeah, it's at least when I was in the squadron, it was a pretty informal application process. Mostly raise your hand, indicate interest. If you're performing solidly as a pilot, then you're considered for it.
Nice. So, you did spend a total of 10 years in the Navy,
Mhm.
on active duty, but then after your service commitment was up, you did end up deciding to leave the Navy. So how did that come about, and what was your plan what was your plan for what you were going to do after you left the Navy?
Yeah, I was not really sure. It was a tough decision because, you know, I was halfway to retirement, and I felt like because I had grown up in the military and been a Marine Corps brat, I felt like I had been in the military for 30 years at that point, over 30 years. And I was really curious what it would be like to be a civilian. And I think when I was 30, waiting until I was, 40, or I guess 42 to retire felt like forever. Now I look back and it's not that long, but I really wanted to have kids, and at that point, it was still challenging for a woman jet aviator to have children, because if you're flying in an aircraft that has an ejection seat, as soon as you became pregnant, you were grounded. I believe that's changed recently. So now women who are flying in ejection seat aircraft can continue flying up to a later point in their pregnancies. So that was a factor, wanting to have kids. And it's just challenging to time it if I stayed in. But many women do, they make it work. So I think because I had grown up in the military though as well, I just was yearning to have more control over my life and more freedom. As a naval aviator, the next 10 years, I knew pretty much exactly what the next 10 years were going to look like. And it wasn't going to afford me time to get a graduate degree. And and I'd have to keep my fingers crossed that the pregnancies aligned with my shore tour, my sea tour rotations. So all those things lined up, and I decided that when my commitment was done, I would get out. So when I was thinking about what to do next, I wasn't sure that I wanted to go to the airlines. I really enjoyed working with people, and being a division officer and a department head. Those were my favorite part. Well, I loved flying too, but I really loved working with the people. And so when I thought about what to do next, I knew some people who had gotten out of the military and gone to business school, and that sounded like a really good way to transition out into the civilian world. So that's what I ended up doing.
Yeah, so you did end up going into the business world. I heard that you also did a little bit of tech in there. So what were some of the lessons that you took from the military? Because I'm sure that you learned a lot of life lessons in your time in the military. So what were
Yeah.
some of those that you took from the Navy to tech and business and all those other industries?
One of my favorite things I like to share is the saying that we hear in flight school from day one, which is aviate, navigate, communicate. And so for me in business, what that meant is aviate means is like, is anyone about to die? Because that's as a pilot, you're first making sure that you're safely flying. And nothing else happens until you ensure that you and the crew are safe and you're flying. So as a leader, it was, am I doing the things I need to do to achieve my goals? Do I have my priorities? Are those super clear? And am I making sure that my team is able to do that? Um, and then, navigate is figuring out where am I going? Am I doing my mission correctly? And that for me feels a little bit longer term. Like, am I working in jobs that are going to help me do the type of work that I want to do in the world? And finally, communicate. In the military, it's, once you're safely flying and you're doing your mission, then you can communicate with air traffic control or with people outside the aircraft. And that way they can also help you, not just to tell them what you're doing, but also to get support if you need it. And communicate as a leader for me has been, you know, uh, leveraging that community and the network that I've built over my time in the military, my time in business, and supporting them as well and maintaining and nurturing those relationships. So, aviate, navigate, communicate is something I still fall back on. And I think, let's see, other lessons from the time in the military. I think I'm really good at compartmentalizing for better or worse. I think that I'm really good in high pressure situations from my training in the military and the work that I had to do there. So I like doing operational roles and I enjoy being able to bring that sense of calm to a high stress environment. And that's why I really enjoyed working at startups was because I think when you have perspective about life and death, literally, as well as figuratively, it's easier to prioritize and to make smarter decisions. So, yeah, so I think being able to compartmentalize and prioritize from the Navy, that's helped me in the business world as well.
Yeah, those are definitely important lessons that probably anybody could use in their life, but that are very important. But I heard that you also had a one-woman show. I gotta ask, how did that come about?
Yeah. Gosh, it was one of those things where I was writing, I was in a writing group and it was a lot of personal narrative. And I started noticing that when I'd share stories about my experience in the Navy, people were really fascinated because most people don't have the opportunity to serve. Even if they do, most people don't get to fly. And so I started thinking maybe this would be something interesting. I wasn't sure what format to put it in. But when I was in high school and even in college, I enjoyed theater and I did plays, I wrote plays. I thought, um, as I was writing these personal narrative pieces, the woman who ran the group said, "Have you ever thought about maybe doing a one-woman show?" And I hadn't. And I thought, wow, this actually could be a really fun way to fulfill that part of me that always enjoyed being on a stage in a theater and write something that would share stories about, not just me, but the people who are out there, every day on an aircraft carrier serving our country. So I did write the show and I was supposed to perform it in, I think it was May 2020. That did not happen. And instead, I workshopped it a couple times on Zoom with friends and family. And then I was able to perform it at a solo festival in New York City. So it premiered off Broadway in November of 2021. And then the summer 2022, I took it to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. And since then, I've performed it at the Hollywood Fringe Festival and on off Broadway again in New York at the end of 2023. It's been sitting on the shelf since then. exploring how to expand it and maybe explore some other themes around it, maybe make it more than a one-person show. So I view it as a work in progress, just like myself. So I'm curious to see what comes up as I think about developing it further.
I don't know about you. I don't know any other fighter pilots or former military pilots that have had a play. That's pretty interesting, but I think
Mm,
that's pretty cool. Um,
thank you.
I know I I know I asked you earlier about some important lessons you took from the Navy to business, but what do you think over your time, your 10 years in the Navy, your other time in business, doing plays, what do you think the most important lesson you learned that you can pass forward to someone else would be?
Mm, it would be to be curious. And not, yeah, I would say it's not just about intellectual curiosity and wanting to learn more about things. I think it's also wanting to learn more about people. And I feel like we often want to feel like we're right. I think that's a natural human tendency, but I think that the world would be in a better place if we got more curious about each other and what's going on in our lives and trying to find the commonalities in our experiences. And that takes curiosity. It takes being open to hearing about different people. And so I feel like that's helped me in the sense that I've learned about so many interesting things. I've been so fortunate to have some incredible experiences in my life. And if I hadn't been curious, I don't think those would have happened. So I would encourage people to be curious.
Now I'm just now realizing that we didn't. Usually, I ask pilots about their call signs. Usually, do you have a call sign? Because
I do.
realizing I didn't talk about that. I don't know how often S-3 pilots use that, but I love hearing the call
Oh,
sign stories, and I'm realizing that I didn't ask you about it. So,
yeah, no worries. No, all naval aviators get call signs, and usually it's for something that you screw up, or actually, I would say oftentimes it's because of your name, and that's what my call sign's from. My last name is pronounced Draude, and so my call sign is Rowdy. And I always joke like if my call sign was based on my personality, it would be not rowdy because I'm not like a really rowdy person, but it was an easy one to remember because it rhymes with my last name.
interesting. All
Yeah.
right.